Long before the Romans marched, before Germanic tribes carved their names into Europe, there emerged a culture, forged across rivers, forests, and time. This is the story of Celtic Ethnogenesis, a tale of migration, language shifts, cultural fusion, and archaeological mystery. Where did the Celts really come from? And why has their origin puzzled historians, linguists, and archaeologists for over 2 millennia? Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. As per the title of this video, today we are talking about Celtic Ethnogenesis. This is the 4th episode of an ongoing series on the origins of several people and cultures. As you can see, these are the other 3 episodes and you'll find links in the description below. Today's topic, compared to the other 3, is more nuanced than you would think. With that being said, if there is any specific civilization/people that would like me to dedicate an episode on within this series, let me know in the comments below. Now let's dive in. The first thing we need to do for our comprehensive analysis, to be precise, is to establish a common understanding of the word Celt, Celtic, because there are at least 3 different ways in which this word is commonly used. The first usage is linguistic. In other words, the Celts are people speaking Indo-European-Celtic languages, such as Gaulish, Celtiberian, Lepontic, Insular Celtic, etc. The second usage is archaeological, Celts being groups associated with the Hallstatt and Tène material cultures of Iron Age temperate Europe. Last but not least, the third is using Celt as an ethnonymic. This is a historical frame of reference and it indicates the peoples whom Greek and Roman authors called Keltoí, Celtae. And as we read the authors, these are usually identified as populations living in Transalpine Gaul, parts of Iberia, northern Italy, and the like. As a simple initial definition, we could say that the Celts are a series of different European people, at least in their later form, interconnected by a common cultural denominator. Whenever we use the term Celtic as an umbrella term, we are connecting different people, different tribes, with similar linguistic aspects, which we will dive into towards the end of the video briefly, but most importantly, cultural ones. And when we say culture, we also include the ritualistic aspects of common religious beliefs. Just to give you a frame of reference, it would be a bit like saying Germanic. That includes many different cultures that have common linguistic aspects and organizational characteristics. Likewise, it's a bit like saying Mediterranean cultures when you are connecting different people, although they all have a common denominator. Now, given these are not perfectly interchangeable, because at the end of the day there is an extra step of connectivity when we talk about Celts, which is one of the reasons why it leads to all sorts of different academic discourses and debates as to whether or not maybe these people were more connected than we think, and this will go into a discussion about their ethnicity and phenotypic traits. The reality is that the ever-increasing expansion of the Celtic archetype all over continental and insular realities is a fact. But if we were to go back in time, what would be the very core of the initial Celtic stratus? In approximately 600 BC, Greek settlers living in Massilia, modern-day Marseille, France, used the term Keltoí to describe the inhabitants of the Provence region. The Romans later adapted this Greek word into Latin as Celtae, Celts, and applied it broadly to all people living north of Provence, extending it into the Alpine regions. Several ancient references require classification regarding Celtic identity. The Ister was the historical name for what we now call the Danube River. The Senasians represented a distinct group from the Iberian Peninsula, whom Herodotus did not classify as Celtic people. Herodotus mentions a city called Pyrene, which remains archaeologically unidentified, as the starting point of the Danube. This reference could indicate either the river's actual source in Germany's Black Forests, or possibly a coastal settlement near the Black Sea in present-day Bulgaria, where the river reaches its mouth. Roman classification systems didn't group Belgians and Germanic tribes with Celtic people. Similarly, when Romans encountered populations in Britain, they maintained distinct categories for the island's various inhabitants, rather than labeling them all as Celts. Let's first try and map a nucleus of Celtic ethnogenesis using the words of the ancients. Let's begin with Julius Caesar, or Julius Caesar. We'll be reading from Commentari de Bello Gallico, where he describes various tribes as he distinguishes the Celts from Germanic tribes. In Book 1, we read, Latin provided above, all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, another the Aquitani, and the third those who, in their own language, are called Celtae, in our language, Galli. So focusing on this part very quickly. Tertiam, a third type of people, qui ipsorum lingua Celtae. So in their language are called Celtae. Of course, this is a Latinization of it. Nostra, ours, in ours, of course, understood by context. Lingua, so language. Galli, Gauls, appellantur. We call them. Now, this passage is significant because at least in the mind of Julius Caesar, who is a high witness and a man who directly came into contact with several populations of the area of Western and Central Europe, he specifically connects the Celts with the Gauls, telling us these are the Celts. Another author who not only mentions the Celts but also gives us a description to help us visualize these people is Diodorus Siculus. In his Bibliotheca Historia 528 1-3, he says, open quotes, "The Gauls are tall of body, with rippling muscles and white of skin, and their hair is blonde, for they are always washing their hair in lime water." Furthermore, in a later passage, he also tells us that their women are as large as the men, and their children are born with greyish hair, which darkens to match their parents as they age. On top of this, he also tells us that the Celts tend to shave their face, exception being their moustache, which they let grow. This is an interesting area of comparison here. Caesar hardly describes the physical appearance of the Gauls, focusing mostly on their social structure and military practices. In contrast, Caesar does provide physical description of the Britons. He tells us, open quotes, "All the Britons dye themselves with woad, which produces a bluish color. They wear their hair long and shave every part of the body, except the head and upper lip." Close quotes. Strabo in Geographica 4.2 and 4.5.2, written between 7 BC and 23 Anno Domini, gives us more explicit physical traits, particularly when he compares Britons and Gauls. Open quotes, "The Britons are taller than the Kelti, and not so yellow-haired, although they are less strong in build." Close quotes. So indirectly, we have another mention of blonde hair being a characteristic of Celts. Here is a 3-way comparison table of the 3 authors, their physical descriptions, and areas of overlap. Polybius also gives us a physical description, as he is specifically talking about a contingent of Gaesatae. He tells us that the Celts of North Italy wore trousers and cloaks, but the Gaesatae fought naked. And at the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, Polybius describes the naked Celts and the Iberians with their short linen tunics with purple borders, and Livy speaks of the Gauls naked from the navel up, and on the Iberians with dazzlingly white tunics bordered with purple. Similarly, the Celts in Asia Minor, who we believe have preserved this custom, are described as naked in battle, with skin white because they were never exposed in exempt in battle. Note how Dionysius of Halicarnassus also expressing long hair as a characteristic of these tribes. Worth of note that Tacitus, whenever he discusses and compares the Celts and the Britons, keeping in mind that he never refers to the Britons as Celts, even though we do know that they were Celtic at least through a current linguistic analysis, he tells us that while the Caledoni in modern-day Scotland, strongly built and with red hair, he also mentions the Silures with tanned complexion and curly hair. If you like this video, please consider getting one of my plushies. It really helps supporting the production of more complex and deeply researched videos. There are only a few days left, so please consider getting yours today. Thank you for your support. Of course, while we talk about common phenotypic traits among Celtic populations, we also have to underline that in their height during the Iron Age, these Celtic realities had dominated 3/4 of Europe, which means that even though these would be typical elements, at least in the eyes of the Mediterraneans, to describe a Celt, the reality is that there would have been a certain level of differentiation among these people. We shouldn't imagine a single phenotypic trait to be absolute in such a large geographic area. The extension and success of such population clusters has to do with significant advances in agrarian, metallurgical, architectural, and economic substrata, allowing them to extend their influence over large spans of land. When trying to get to the roots of the Celtic identity, we have to consider two competing models. The traditional model, giving the Celts a Central European origin, specifically in their Hallstatt core, where Proto-Celtic arises in the Urnfield. Geographically, this would be between eastern France, southern Germany, western Bohemia, parts of Austria and Switzerland, which subsequently expanded through land and seafaring. Continuing to the Latène culture, which represents the fully fledged expansion of Celtic-speaking people, west, south and east. Of this cultural reality would match well with the distribution of attested Celtic place names in antiquity. And the Insular model, generally pushed by the likes of Barry Cunliffe and John Koch, which proposes an earlier Celticization along the Atlantic facade, imagining Iberia, Armorica, Britain and Ireland, subsequently expanding through a Bronze Age maritime network. Both models have been recently criticized. Most of the criticism stemming from the fact that it is in fact difficult to define clearly who is a Celt, both spatially and in regards to time, preventing it from becoming a universally applicable definition. To make matters even more complicated when it comes to the context of who is a real Celt or not, we have a third approach, a so-called non-essentialistic approach, which tries to reject general classifiers when it comes to what and who a Celt is, whether it be through observable features, phenotypic trait, genomic mutations, and linguistic ties. While it was worth mentioning it is important for me to underline that I'm not going to go into the details of the essentialistic and non-essentialistic debate because they're rooted in politics. In fact, very modern politics and the idea of fostering or trying to reject nationalism at all costs, including that of pragmatic, scientific and academically sound interpretation. I might tackle it on a separate video. However, the Hallstatt culture, particularly towards the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, rather than being the representation of a homogeneous group of tribes, would be more correctly classified as a comprehensive cultural system. Note, for instance, of a major difference between the linguistic aspects of the Western Hallstatt culture, which will speak languages that would be considered Celtic in nature, and the Eastern section, which instead will become the Illyrian world of the classics. The separate cultures of Gola Secca in northern Italy and Castreja in the Iberian Peninsula, while detached by the Hallstatt Central European culture, do also present Celtic characteristics. While all of this may be confusing, it is in the 5th century BC that we finally start to see the rise of the so-called Latène culture, deriving from a western branch of the Hallstatt culture. And while we don't know exactly what gave rise to the beginning of this Iron Age Proto-Celtic reality, with some historians speculating Scythian influence, among other things, with one of the major characteristical differences of the societal organization being the abandonment of the high priest king of the Hallstatt period in favor of the growth of an aristocratic warrior class. I would like to now spend a few words on the linguistic section. Now, of course, this is a very deep topic and I would like to reserve it for a dedicated video on my language-focused channel, Metatron's Academy. But for now, let's touch upon it. We know that there is a level of connection between several languages and several people that spoke these languages that we now call Celtic, essentially epigraphic analysis, meaning anything relating to words that are written on or cut into hard material such as clay, stone, or the study of these. And of course, as we reach the Middle Ages, some of this material was actually written in forms of manuscripts. The original Celtic language initially split between continental and insular, which gave rise to several different languages. As we can see through this representation of Celtic language taxonomy, the Great Celtic language is divided into Celtic Q and Celtic P, and these are to be seen as two distinct branches. One of the characteristics of Celtic Q, for instance, is the fact that we have some languages which are still spoken, such as Gaelic, which is spoken in Ireland, in some of its varieties, and also those languages spoken in the Iberian Peninsula in the continental section, which unfortunately are now extinct. And as you can see from Gaelic, you have two more languages, Manx, spoken in the Isle of Man, and Irs, which is Scottish Gaelic. When it comes to Celtic P, in the continent sphere, then we would have the language spoken by the Gauls, but also Brittonic, which then connects to other languages such as Welsh, Cornish and Breton, which are still spoken. By looking at this diagram, you will have noticed that Pictish, which is an extinct language belonging to the P Celtic branch, is not the type of Celtic language spoken in Scotland, whereas a Celtic language belonging to the Q branch, is Scottish Gaelic. And the reason for this is purely historical, as it has to do with population movement and invasions in the High Middle Ages. As a substantial group of pirates coming from Ireland by the name of Scoti relocate in the southwest corner of Caledonia, or Scotland, hence the name, founding the kingdom of Dalriada. Now, there is a lot more that can be said, as for example why there are some languages that are clearly from Celtic P and they are of Brittonic origin, and yet they are spoken in modern-day France. Now, all of this is clearly fascinating, and if you're interested in a deep analysis of the history and linguistic connection of the Celtic languages, let me know in the comments, and I'll make a dedicated episode for my Metatron's Academy second channel. And with that, we reach the conclusion for today's episode on the origins and ethnogenesis of the Celts. The Celtic reality is partially shrouded in mystery. We do have ancient connotations, descriptions, and analyses that help us picture what a typical Celt would have looked like in period. But as we move through time, population relocations, the picture will become blurry. A strong core of ancient European people, either from Central Europe or from the Western hinterland, is to be expected as the basis of true Celtic ethnogenesis. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.